Welcome to MSD at Home. I think we'll begin to make a slow start as more guests arrive in our virtual auditorium. Welcome to MSD at Home, where we take you into the COVID-19 co-isolated living rooms of a number of thinkers and practitioners in architecture and design. My name is Hélène Frichot. I've recently joined the Melbourne School of Design and the Faculty of Architecture, Building and Planning as Professor of Architecture and Philosophy and Director of the Bachelor of Design, having previously been the Director of Critical Studies in Architecture at KTH Stockholm, Sweden. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which I live and work, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, who have been custodians of this land for thousands of years. I pay my respects to their elders, past and present, and Aboriginal elders of other communities who may be online today. Thanks for joining us today, Reinhold. It's quite late at night there in New York.
Yeah, it's okay. Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Now, you're a Professor of Architecture in the Graduate School of Architecture, Planning and Preservation at Columbia University, where you direct the Temple Hoyne Buell Center for the Study of American Architecture. And you are also a member of the Center for Comparative Media. You're one of the founding co-editors of the important journal Grey Room, which brings together scholarly and theoretical articles from the fields of architecture, art, media, and politics. Your books include The Organizational Complex, Architecture, Media, and Corporate Space of 2003, Utopia's Ghost, Architecture and Postmodernism, again from 2010, and The Urban Apparatus, Mediapolitics and the City, 2016. And I also understand that your new book, Knowledge Worlds, Media, Materiality, and the Making of the Modern University is forthcoming with Columbia University Press. In your role with the Temple Hoyne Buell Center, you have been instrumental in collaborating on the exhibition House Housing, An Untimely History of Architecture and Real Estate, and the accompanying book, The Art of Inequality, Architecture, Housing and Real Estate, a Provisional Report, which has been an inspiration to me, to former colleagues in Stockholm and to some of my new colleagues here at the University of Melbourne. Having drawn real estate and property concerns under the purview of architectural discourse, the Temple Hoyne Buell Center is now heading toward questions of infrastructure and power, including approaches to green reconstruction. We're going to hear some of your preliminary thoughts on this topic today, as well as being offered a guided tour of the Buell Center website. It also looks like we might be venturing questions of care again, which has turned out to be something of a recurring motif across some of our previous sessions with MSD at Home. Reinhold Martin, welcome. I hand the screen to you and you can go ahead and share it with us now.
Okay, great. Well, thanks so much, Hélène. And it's very nice to see everybody. We're getting used to the alienation in which we see ourselves on the screen, but know that there's maybe somebody listening. Or watching, as the case may be. And so what I'm going to do is just share my screen with you. And as Hélène said, begin with a kind of tour through some of the recent work that the Buell Center that we've been doing at the Buell Center, that is documented, recorded, produced on this website, which is actually, and I think you can see the URL, it's called Power, and the URL is power.buellcenter.columbia.edu. It's not technically the Buell Center website per se. We have our own kind of institutional website. This is a sort of project in and of itself, Power, Infrastructure in America. And that's what I'm going to spend a bit of time with here at the beginning. So again, to try to make as many connections as possible, I'll begin by acknowledging just how surreal this is. I don't think I'm going to get used to this. I mean, I've done a few such talks before, but the idea that in many ways we're sharing the same experience of isolation, as Hélène said, but in very different ways and in very different circumstances. And so kind of that problem is running a little bit behind where we're going with this, basically. And I'm going to start where we are now, and I'm going to go backwards, because it's a kind of effort on a regular basis as we work, the way probably you are too, remotely. And when I say we, I'm speaking about the Buell Center Associate Director, Jacob Moore, and the Buell Center program manager, Jordan Steingard, with both of whom I work very regularly and closely in everything that I'm going to show you. And in fact, Jacob and Jordan in different ways have taken the lead in many cases on different aspects of this work. So I really want to acknowledge their contribution as sort of co-leaders, collaborators, but also co-leaders of this effort. I direct the Buell Center, so they actually are the Buell Center because they're there on a full-time basis whenever we get to go back to our office again. But whereas I, as a faculty member at GSAP, the Architecture School at Columbia, I teach and I do my own work. I write books. I do other things, and so my role is somewhat different. It's more it's a sort of directorial role, but it's also on a day-to-day basis, basically one of guiding conversations, discussions, and projects, meaning the actual outputs of these things, but while at the same time sort of allowing them and encouraging them to take on lives of their own. And it's that kind of culture that we've tried to build outwards from, and the Power website really is a gesture towards this, to recognize that not so much the structure, the institutional structure of a center in which something might be happening. Let's say there are events, maybe there's a conference, or there's a workshop or something, and then there's a world to whom we broadcast all of this, and we hope somebody's listening. Rather, to build networks, to build partnerships, collaborations of various kinds. And I'll try to give you a little bit of a sense of that too as we go, because that really is the kind of essence of what we're attempting to do here, at least. So power is it meant to mean everything that word means in English. In other words, both energy and political power and force. And so when we couple that with infrastructure, we have a kind of politics of technology, a politics of territory, in the case of climate change in particular, of energy, and that, so you can think about that politics and this kind of dual sense of the term power as sort of running in the background as well. So the website is sort of set up like this, that there are two sides, and the sort of central content is on the left, and then the supporting content on the right, and it breaks down in terms of different types of activities. So what you're seeing on the kind of splash page right now is the principal initiative that I'm going to explain in a second, Green Reconstruction, but also ongoing work like collaborative publishing. This is an event I'll show you a little bit about later that we did back when we could gather in person in November, and so on. And I'll invite you to, this is basically one big invitation to come and visit this website and use it, because it's meant to be used. It's really conceived as a teaching resource, actually. And when we talk about what is on here and what we try to put, add to the website, we're really thinking about a general audience of teachers and students who could, from basically anything from high school to graduate school and beyond, of course, professionals and interested parties, anybody who is interested in a sense, infrastructure, citizenship, and politics. So here, Green Reconstruction is, in a sense, an extension of work that we've done for a while on the Green New Deal, which I know has taken different forms around the world. The actual New Deal reference is very American-centric, and I apologize for that. The historical reference is to the public works and jobs programs of the 1930s, like the TVA. But what we're, in a sense, essentially proposing at this point, given where we are now in the kind of intertwined set of crises that we're in now. Here I think you can read this, 3 contemporary crises of care, of political economy, and of climate. Like the climate crisis didn't go away. It's still, happening. And so we're asking you and our readers to to think these together as really one multidimensional crisis, and think about then specifically things that we certainly have experienced here in the United States as the absence of planning, as planned. So when there wasn't enough PPE to go around, that was planned. That was planned because it was governed by so-called market forces. That was conscious, it was deliberate. Likewise with racial oppression and ecological apartheid. Likewise with the interaction of public health and environmental justice, healing the planet and healing society, and so on. So we pose this as a series of questions. Now translated from, this is also a reference to US history from the New Deal period as a period of progressive government-led investment and not really structural transformation, but semi-structural transformation, to a period when there really was the closest that you can get. It was the period in the immediate aftermath of the US Civil War, something like structural transformation, or at least an attempt thereof, which is Reconstruction, the attempt to basically rebuild the South as a democracy. The statues that are now coming down around the country that probably maybe you've seen, some of them date to that period or at the immediate aftermath of Reconstruction. They celebrate Confederate leaders, in other words, slave owners and so on, who opposed Reconstruction. So the politics of this goes quite deep, and it's more than just it's historical, but it's politics of history and of memory, and as well as of the present. And we too are, in a sense, seeking to remember that politics and to, in a sense, appeal to certain ghosts from the American path as we start thinking about how we might not simply recover or rebuild out of the damage that the pandemic and the vast economic damage that has accompanied it has wrought, but really to reconstruct. So I'm just going to click through these tabs. So this is the tab that you get when you click on that, and you see a little bit more detail along the themes that I was just describing. And basically, this is what, if you see this section right here, what the kind of core of the project is. Since I know that I'm speaking to a school of the built environment, an architecture school, and speaking to students and professors and scholars and so on, as well as professionals, I want to invite you to think about the infrastructures that govern and produce and reproduce what we teach. Principal amongst which is the curriculum. And so what we're actually doing right now, and this is happening like literally as we speak, is we've got a group of, we have a team. We usually work with teams of students, and I really want to recognize them. There's a couple that will appear on the screen, some previous collaborators from among student workers who are working as we speak in kind of playing out this hypothesis, basically, that the professional school environment is a curriculum, is a place to start, to begin reconstructing, first with the imagination, what we can and cannot imagine, what possibilities are and are not on the table. When in an architecture school, you might teach studio, or if I teach history, or if there's a tech course or a professional practice course, and all the rest. So the goal being, under the kind of general sort of ethos of what I frequently refer to as a kind of public pedagogy. In other words, that being really the mission of the Buell Center. Technically, we are tasked to study American architecture, landscape, and urbanism. But the particular way in which we typically study this, and we do it in different media, from exhibitions to publications to websites now, that we do this is through different forms of public pedagogy of teaching, which means teaching ourselves, learning and unlearning also, and then relearning, and then through these collaborations, working with students, with colleagues, and with publics of various kinds. So here the goal isn't going to happen quite by the end of the summer, but we're kind of staging it in phases, but the basic idea of the work that we're doing on the summer is to educate ourselves, our colleagues, and our students into ways of thinking and acting that link professional responsibility with societal change. So the way you might think about this, I'll translate to the US context, is when there was what is now called or sometimes called a Muslim ban, the ban on persons of Muslim origin entering this country in the first phase of the tyranny that we're now living with. The lawyers, in particular, many of my colleagues, in fact, from the law school, rushed out to the airports to help the people who were landing on these planes and were being turned back, and to help them get visas and to help them enter the country. More recently, all over the world, and certainly here, doctors rushed to the emergency rooms. Not just the ER doctors, but pretty much any. In New York, it was literally every doctor, anybody, and nurses, of course, and all the care professionals rushed to this task, and they're still doing it. And so the question is, where are the architects? Okay, now it's not an indictment of the field or anything like that, but it's not so self-evident to where an architect or even a professor of architecture like myself or any of us would rush when called by the ethos, let's say, of generally what we can call the liberal professions. There's nothing radical about any of this. This is just basically what sometimes is taught as a professional ethic or something like that. So it's that kind of open question that we're trying to bring into focus here, and not just with architects, but also with urban planners and other built environment professionals. And we're trying in the first stage of this to bring that into focus in order to outline pedagogical frameworks and put them online and make them available to anyone, including yourselves, if anybody wants to change how they teach. So this is a little bit different, and it's a little bit of an extension of the various syllabi projects and things that surely you've seen and maybe participated in. There's some very important ones on race and space and race and architecture and urbanism and politics, of course. Circulating and being put together as we speak. There are also pandemic syllabi circulating, very important work. What we're really talking about is what's underneath that, is the very premise of the syllabus. That's why when I say infrastructure, that's what I mean. And the basic idea that there's a structure to how you teach. It could have to do with required classes versus electives, whatever, that kind of thing. But ultimately, that structure carries content in a tacit manner. So I won't go into further detail on that, other than saying that, you can see up here, ultimately something like a professional school curriculum will emerge, I expect, at least from this. We're not sure what that looks like, and we're in the process of inviting all kinds of collaboration and input from outside our little sphere, as we start the conversation. And by the way, I should say we're focusing, this is to the care question, on and trying to track the way in which curricular programs, in a sense, shape imaginations through what we're calling 3 systems of care, of housing, health, and education. And think about it, you can think of these as building types. It's housing, hospitals, and schools. And the way that those kinds of buildings are not taught in an architecture curriculum, for example, or in a planning curriculum as in elements of a city. And the reason we're focusing on those, this goes to the New Deal question, but also to Reconstruction. Behind this is the question of the role of the state, the role of public investment. We've done a lot of work on public housing prior to this, and the role and the critique of the neoliberal marketplace as the governor, as the authority that writes our curricula for us. So this is a refusal of that, and an attempt not simply to substitute states for markets or something like that, but an attempt to think differently about how value is produced, including economic value, when we design or imagine architecture or study its histories. And the criteria and the premise assumptions by which that value is produced and circulated. So okay, so now I'll leave that, and if you have questions, we can go on. I'll go now to what came right before this, which is a project we often collaborate we have been collaborating recently with a number of folks, some of whose names you see here listed as authors of various articles, like Kate Aronoff, who's a very important journalist now at the New Republic, writing on climate politics, who are associated with the discourse around the Green New Deal. Here, Daniel Donna Cohen, who's another person. Maybe you know Billy Fleming, who's at Penn. Daniel and Billy are at Penn, and Billy runs the McCarg Center. He's the director there. And we, back in the previous times, we worked together on Green New Deal matters. I'll show you a little bit. And we co-sponsored a very big conference at Penn, at which you saw Naomi Klein here. She was a keynote person and a speaker, and so on and so forth. So basically, what we're trying to do is to support the conversation, the debate around the Green New Deal, and so a lot of that is kind of now spilling over here. You can see the dates on this. What this is it's just basically it's a daily reading list during the high period of hopefully is the highest period, but we don't know, of the pandemic here in the States, at least in New York, because you'll see the dates begin in mid-March, and it goes to the end of May. And what we were doing is just collecting readings that put this in perspective in various ways and speak to some of the issues that I was just referring to, having to do with the role of the public sector, the role of the debates around climate change, and some of the other, let's say, narratives that had been attached to this debate that was and still is forming around the Green New Deal. This little sort of piece of the website is called Green Stimulus, because some folks, Daniel and Billy among them, wrote a basically kind of memo and circulated in Congress amongst various progressive members of Congress and other government officials in the US, saying, look, basically, and you can click this link if you want to see it, this is what you would do if you're going to do stimulus spending now. This is what we can do, and we can in a sense merge stimulus spending, relief and recovery spending with climate justice initiatives along the lines of the Green New Deal. So we were trying to, and many of the readings that are kind of collected here refer to different aspects of proposals and conversations like that. Not necessarily that particular proposal, but efforts to sort of steer the both policymaking and the public imagination in that direction. Prior to that, as I said, we had been working for a couple of years, really, in and around cultivating a public conversation, discourse and debate, public pedagogy around the Green New Deal. This piece of the website explains what the Green New Deal is. It's a resolution. It's not a piece of legislation. It didn't get passed. It was introduced in the House by Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and is really there as a kind of marker to say this is where we should be. It's a kind of benchmark. This is a very common technique that's used in the U.S. legislature to sort of advance discussion around particular issues without any real expectation that it's going to get approved. And that's what happened. It generated quite a lot and continues to generate quite a lot of interest, a lot of activism, and a lot of reflection. And so this is our summary about how we think that we can contribute, again, to public discourse around these questions. And one is to link policy with politics, because very frequently in climate discussions, maybe you're familiar with this, these are limited to policy solutions, so to speak, or matters simply of prescribing this or that regulation, etc. These are all political questions, and we have really worked very hard, and I hope you can see that in some of the readings we've collected and some of the other bits of evidence that are on the site, in insisting on this link between the two. also working across scales. This is something that architects and urbanists are usually pretty good at, to think of the climate question simultaneously as a universal question, but not in the sense that it affects everyone equally, but universal in that it affects everyone unequally. That's its universality. And so that it compels us to think in very site-specific ways about the inequities, the barriers, and so on that are thrown up by new forms of environmental injustice, as well as old legacy ones. In a particular place at a particular time. There's lots of writing on this site that documents that, particularly in the American South, and then how that sort of connects with things that are happening at larger scales. And to do that, we have tried to train ourselves and our collaborators, our students, and so on, to think relationally and systemically. So, for example, today there's a lot of discussion about and a critique of systemic racism. But most important, it seems to me, to move that project forward into real action is to take seriously, to recognize and be able to see a system, to be able to understand, okay, yes, absolutely, it's systemic. In fact, it's structural. But the question is, what is the system? And so then when somebody says, we're going to do this, we're going to do that, then a particular proposal, particular course of action, then that course of action can be measured against the understanding of the system. And similarly for climate, as I said, the climate change, it says it here, climate change is not a historical problem. It didn't just happen, it's a project. This is something I think is very important to recognize. Climate change has been a project since basically oil executives and other actors in the energy sector in particular became aware of what was happening several decades ago, and covered it up or minimized it, and tried to drill as much as possible before the general public figured it out. That's the project. And so we need to recognize it as such, do not approach it in a passive thing that simply happens to the planet. It is being produced. And so with that perspective, understand that the first, in a sense, recipients of this project, the ones who are in the crosshairs first are what are called frontline communities, and then the rest. This is a little bit of the language of the Green New Deal too, so you can read some of that on the site. Okay, I'll go a little more quickly, and then we can have some questions. We also, in the spirit of different dimensions of this public pedagogy, we have been looking into what we actually might mean by the term infrastructure, and particularly as that term bears on the fields of the built environment, architecture, urbanism, landscape, to which we are most directly responsible. In this case, I mean, we did do, I'm not going to show you that, there's other material on the site here that asks what happened when infrastructure fails, what happens when it fails. The cases that are studied are Flint, Michigan, and New Orleans, the Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans, and the austerity water failure in Flint. The first thing that happens, just the short answer to that, what happens when infrastructure fails is that democracy is suspended. That's what happened in both of these places. Local democracy was suspended, an emergency manager is brought in, and then somebody tries to fix it. And that's the neoliberal, in a sense, aspect of this, is the suspension of elected government and governing by managers, appointed, unelected, and basically corporate sector managers. Anyway, you can see more information about that on the site. This is different. This is what I'm showing you here is what we call A&E services, architectural engineering services. And this, the question very simply here is a philosophical question that many of us who do theory ask all the time. And the question is, what is architecture? But more specifically, when we recognize that when we do theory, we also do history. What is architecture under particular historical circumstances? And the answer in this case is, given the space that I've been describing that we're studying, it's whatever the US government says it is. And so what we have in here, I will directly acknowledge and be able to acknowledge because names are listed, a whole group of students, they're listed under people here, who undertook this work over the course of the past year, by beginning with US public databases, procurement power, procurement databases. Basically, what happens when there's a hurricane? They did this with New Orleans. What does FEMA, which is the government, the US Emergency Management Agency, what do? They hire somebody. They outsource it, most of it. And what do they hire them to do? They might hire them to do an inspection of a flooded basement or of a sewer system or something like that. And what happens then after that is politics. I mean, what happens with the hiring is politics, but what we see is what sometimes is called technopolitics, but the politics of infrastructure. So what happens in New Orleans, for example, is that basically the entire stock of public housing in New Orleans was condemned. The process of privatization was already underway, but this accelerated. And it was these experts, these architects and engineers and people working for these big anonymous firms like Fluor, you maybe know AECOM, and others, who many of which are publicly traded. This is architecture, right? In fact, the very significant numbers of graduates, maybe in your institution as well, and maybe some of the students who are listening to this talk, go on to work for these firms. A lot of our students do. So it's the real world, so to speak, of what we mean when we speak about architecture. So there, I just want to I just wanted to alert you to this and say that I'm not going to give you the details. They follow the money, and in following the money, they arrived at particular projects that were sort of exemplary projects, and this took place, in meetings, weekly meetings, and students go off and do the work. Jacob and Jordan are guiding it, and I sort of am in and out of the sort of more general sort of strategy meetings and conceptual meetings. And where we're at right now is that we are in the process of producing a pamphlet, or I should say these folks are in the process of authoring a pamphlet that we hope we will eventually be able to print. The idea was to put it on the desks of every student in the School of Architecture at Columbia come September when they arrive back at school, but unfortunately it doesn't look like there are going to be students at desks quite yet that soon. It's going to be produced first as a PDF, but it'll also be available on the website explaining this A&E system. It's called the A&E system, and again, it's a portrait of a system. This is a system that is called architecture and is architecture. It's practiced in a very technical way and a very meaningful way by a vast number of professionals all over the world. And if there is something like a Green New Deal, that this is probably who will build it. Which raises all sorts of questions, because this system has been a machine for privatizing cities, as I explained in New Orleans. And by the way, these videos here, this is the video the students produced on New Orleans, and then this is the one on Flint that explained this much more eloquently than I just did. So finally, I will just to give a little bit of a hint of the kinds of collaborations we do. This is a project called the Right to Infrastructure that is not a Buell Center project per se. This is the project conducted by two collaborators, Danielle Purifoy and Louise Seamster, who are sociologists, social scientists working on historically Black towns. You can see some of the links here. And communities in the American South, and on the politics of infrastructure there, what they call the right to infrastructure. If you follow some of the links on this site and there are other articles that there was a workshop that Louise and Danielle participated in that led to this. Basically, the Buell Center was able to support this work with a grant, and they developed it on their own. And then, we're documenting some of that with them on the website. Through Louise and Danielle also, I won't show it to you right now, but there are other collaborations with a number of publications. These are local, sort of very interesting kind of forms of critical journalism produced by two publications, one called Scalawag and the other is Southerly. There's another one called Belt in the Midwest, with the Scalawag and Southerly are in the South. In which we have developed co-publishing projects in which they publish these stories about dispossession, racialized dispossession, typically around infrastructure in the South, and other related matters, and then we kind of co-publish them, and link, and so on. So, and we support that work with some funding. So that's drills further down, and once you go down into these layers, you wind up back out. That's what I was trying to explain. So we're out there in today's kind of crisis in the beginning with the project of green reconstruction, but all along the networks that pass through this site lead back out in different ways, and again the goal is to connect with other work and other communities and other publics than our own and ourselves, in order to do the collective work of pedagogy that I explained very briefly constitutes the focus of our current work with the Green Reconstruction curriculum. So I think with that, I will, I can stop sharing for a second, yeah? And we can go and see if there are questions, or if I'll hand it over to Hélène. And
excellent. Thank you so much, Reinhold, for that journey through the Power website associated with the Buell Center there. I think there are some really profound things that you're saying about the power also of pedagogy and what we can do in schools of architecture in even sort of redirecting some of the emphases we explore inside the design studio, shifting the imagination. I was really struck by this idea of placing those pamphlets on all the students of architecture's, their tables. And here too, I think there's a real, I guess I'm encouraged by the sense of a real belief in what students might become in their future, if they can become politicized and recognize, the urgent crises around us. I am struck too in terms of the various valencies of an understanding of infrastructure that you're bringing to us here, that we can think through pedagogies as forms of infrastructure through the curriculum. This I found really interesting. So that the infrastructure works in a number of ways. Can you speak more to what this means, I think, for architecture as a discipline, that we kind of crack it out of perhaps its old habits to allow it to engage in infrastructure, which perhaps we would habitually leave to the engineers or others?
No, of course. Well, that's one reason I wanted to show you the A&E project, because this borderline between architecture and engineering gets increasingly blurry. It's always really been historically blurry. It's just that we narrate this in a particular way that distinguishes architects and puts signatures on them and all this. And this is a direct critique of that project. And again, that's a project. The project that we call architecture or signature architecture, all of that is really one of the most embarrassing things that I have to say I've witnessed over the time that I've been working in this field, and it's something we won't go into the depths of it exactly, but in New York it passes through ground zero, and this is if you think of the tragedies that have befallen New York, the city in which I live, work, and teach, over the last 20 years, I think there are more than enough, but the 9/11 being one, the financial crisis, and the sort of predatory real estate machine that is headquartered in New York and is now in the White House is another, and of course the current tragedy being the third. So in all such cases, the question is, okay, where are the architects? That's like I said, okay. And where were they? In 9/11, they were all looking to get their names on those buildings. And it was just embarrassing and just truly, and I don't want to, dig that up, but it's still going, it's still happening. And so this is why we just had this discussion today. You might have seen that the image on, when we had a meeting about this, on that page at A&E, it's the World Trade Center. That's the World Trade Center under construction. And that's there deliberately to signal, saying, to restart that conversation from the ground up, literally what's underground, and how that gets designed and how it gets constructed and configured, from the budgets to the structural systems, to the logistics, the subway goes through there, the urbanism, and so on and so forth. In that, there's an idea about a city. There's an idea about a way of life. And so, another way to think about it in a more, let's say, modest fashion infrastructure, it's like it's in the bathroom of a house. It's where you start. That's where architecture begins. You start there and follow it out. And so think about the fixtures, think about the life of that room. This is not something we're typically comfortable talking about, but this is, every architect knows, when you start in an office, first day, what do? You lay out the restrooms. And that's where life is, it's where politics is, it's where biopolitics is, it's where and so on. So, thinking basically from the inside out, upside down, bottom up, is what we're trying to encourage there. Just quickly on the pedagogy, I didn't say one thing because I didn't want to spend too much time on background, but for the Buell Center, we are an endowed center. So that means that in Temple Hoyne Buell, who was an architect in Colorado actually, and who was a Columbia alum, endowed this center in the 80s for purposes that I think are quite different, probably in his imagination, than what we're doing now. Those were the days of postmodernism. Robert Stern was the first director of the Buell Center, so that I think says something. But fortunately, in a sufficiently generous way, it's not huge, but that we have a certain autonomy, and we're not like writing grants all the time and things like that. So it's really just we're working with the endowment as long as we stay within the rules. We have to study American architecture. As I said, we're studying what the American government calls architecture. So we're sticking to the script. Then we have quite a bit of intellectual autonomy and institutional autonomy, and that enables us to take some distance from curricular obligations or research programs that are kind of sponsored out in the field and things like that. So
this might in a way answer aspects of a question from Donald Bates here, who's really curious to understand the direct and indirect links or the separation between the Buell Center and its focuses relative to teaching and learning in the GSAAP, especially here because I think there's something very powerful that you are unfolding in the relationship between research and teaching. Donald was keen to hear a bit more about that. Yeah.
Hi, Don. This is the alienation.
Yeah.
Just to put the perspective. So I first met Pier Vittorio Aureli in the Buell Center when he was teaching a seminar that was sponsored by the Buell Center at GSAP. That was coordinated when my colleague at that time, Joan Ockman, was directing the Buell Center. So that was, this was, 25 years ago, something like that. Maybe not, 20 years ago, whenever he was teaching at Columbia. And Peter Eisman was the chair of the board of the Buell Center when I became director. So these things connect, and there was a certain pedagogical mission that had echoes of the Institute of Architecture and Urban Studies, and that's sort of like the academy is a vanguard space in which you do kind of theory plus design equals, Aureli, something like that. And we moved that in a slightly different direction. We don't sponsor classes quite like that and have, direct affiliates. But what we've done since the beginning, and we just did a very big version of this around the Green New Deal, is in different ways to try to stimulate thinking and work in the curriculum at GSAP. So in this last year, we did a project, this is also on the website, called Public Works for a Green New Deal, in which we sponsored, again, because we have the flexibility with the funding that we can do. Again, we're very careful. We stay within the stipulations of the endowment, but it enables us to do this kind of work to support teaching. And in this case, we supported, there were 9 or 10 classes across the school at Columbia, from planning, practicum, urban planning, to design studios, all of which engaged with the Green New Deal. as a design problem, as a policy question, as a social political question, a technological one, and so on. And it was quite a lively semester that way. They were like super crits. Some of this is documented also online. Some of the people I was talking about, the group from Penn came over. We traded juries, things like that. And for this is just really pre-shutdown. There was this very lively conversation at Columbia on the Green New Deal, and not just conversation. It wasn't just talk, because there were proposals. It was like, the whole urban design program was one of the classes, and they did the Hudson Valley, and so they kind of reimagined towns in the Hudson Valley along these lines, and you could then look at that and test it and sort of say, okay, this is what it actually might imply. This might work. This doesn't work. This would it have to happen? How does it get funded? All of that stuff. So it's really that kind of work that we're trying to do internally at GSAP in different ways. We collaborate with the Dean's Office. We collaborate with other colleagues, and a lot of it is very pragmatic. But I hope you can see thematic and conceptual kind of consistencies and through lines. There are other things to say, but I won't.
Mm-hmm. So it sounds though that you're able, across a broader sweep of seminars and studio offerings in GSAP, to kind of realign everyone's attention toward the Green New Deal, that you can kind of roll this out and create a larger experimental space across. Yeah, that
was the idea. So basically the idea was that there are simple things, like, you guys probably teach housing in some way in your curriculum. I don't know. One of the things we've been doing for quite a while is to try to put the word public in front of housing and allow that to re-enter the imagination. This is a part of the Green New Deal. In fact, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez wrote a piece of legislation with Bernie Sanders that was a Green New Deal for public housing, and they used some Buell Center materials that we had done on public housing as reference for that, from 10 years ago that we had done. And this stuff takes a long time. But think about it. How many design studios or reviews have you been at in which explicitly the project is to design public housing?
Absolutely, because public housing, or looked at housing, education, or health as the three kind of care.
Yes, you could add that to, exactly. Put public in front of all those systems of care. In other words, not for profit, not a developer client, not like public-private partnerships, which are the code words of neoliberal development, but an actual public project. In the States and in New York in particular, that for white people, that's scary. This is racialized immediately as, and brings back all the ugly histories of segregation, of redlining, and so on that have to do and produced the projects, as there's something sometimes called the public housing projects here and elsewhere. But there's a waiting list of something like 500,000 people to get into those buildings in New York right now.
So you're also saying when we rethink or emphasize that infrastructure should be imagined as a public good, the moment we raise this term public, then it immediately gets tied into issues of race politics as well.
Yes, especially, and that is what these things are converging at the moment. And they always have conversion intertwined in, everywhere, but in this country in very specific ways because of the complex history around race. The specific demands that are being made in the streets now are to defund the police. So it's a kind of reverse. It's like there's too much money going to or abolish the police, which is the more radical claim. But it's not like a naive propositions like utopia without police. Is that in New York there's a proposal to move $1 billion of a $6 billion police budget from the police to other public services like healthcare or education or childcare, anything that are community oriented and supportive rather than punitive. And so it's yes, thinking with that, and that this has been consistently on the pedagogical side as well as in the public sphere in various ways, out there in the world, and even on the street that we have worked. And we've tried to do this in different media, speaking with and to different audiences. I didn't show okay, I'll maybe slip that in. Let's go to another question if there are.
Okay. Yeah, no, I mean, I've got packs of questions, but I'm also where I should we've got some questions popping up here too. So another colleague, Dr. Peter Reisbeck, thanks you for the great talk, and asks you how you think architectural theory can engage with climate activism, and should canonical and history and canonical kind of accounts of history and theory be rewritten in light of this orientation perhaps around climate activism, if I've understood the question correctly?
Yes, the answer is yes. But you know, I mean, we're as scholars, as academics, and thank you for the question. You know, we are trained to be cautious and thoughtful and reflective about our work, like all, you know, academics and all you know, architects too. But there are very specific things that we're cautious about. One is to beware of like the kind of one-to-one immediate equation. And so, you know, as a historian and a theorist, I think about this, you know, about the responsibility that we have to teach mediations, to teach the ways in which, you know, we could say infrastructural policies and systems and practices have mediated the relationship between human beings and their climate, their environment, and what we now call climate. For example, back to curriculum. And I also, by the way, I direct the history theory sequence at GSAP. I'm the director of history theory. So that's a collaborative project. It's not like my project. It's just I happen to administratively direct it, but it's with a group of really amazing colleagues, and we almost never agree on everything, or you know, sometimes we agree on some things. But one of the things we did in the last few years was to restructure our core history sequence, which has been done as two big lecture courses, two survey classes, basically one that started around 1750 to about more or less Crystal Palace, you know, around 1850, and then one from there to the later 20th century, or mid 20th century. We moved the chronological needle a little bit, and now they're called, and we changed the two other things. And this is, I can think about this as infrastructural too. One is we moved from a lecture class to to seminars. They're large seminars. They're about like 25, 30 students in a class. They're now taught by 3 faculty rather than 1 faculty. We teach off a common syllabus that we each modify. So we basically retain primary sources, like we might all read Rousseau's Discourse on Inequality, but we would couple that with something else that each faculty does different, things like that. And we do basically the long 19th century and the long 20th century. And it's called Questions in Architectural History 1 and Questions in Architectural History 2. Now, from my point of view, and I don't speak for everybody in this, it's just that this is the way I have come to think about that. This slight shift this is to the question, shift in periodization allows me as a teacher to be a little more explicit about this class. I teach the 19th century one, which is in the fall. This class as a history of anthropogenic climate change. You know, the Anthropocene, by simply just pointing out that this is around 1800, you know, we can argue about the dates, if it's a steam engine or if it's real industrialization, 1830s in England, coal, etc. But, you know, the thing that we still call the Industrial Revolution happened. I can teach work like, you know, you probably know this from the Swedish milieu, Andres Malm's Fossil Capital.
Exactly.
And so on, as required text. And so, you know, literally, like you can change readings, and we can discuss plantation slavery in the US in relation to Manchester, the mills in Manchester, and the steam engine and textile industry, and to colonization in India, and so on. And that's just how we have tried to conceive, in a sense, a double project of quote unquote globalizing, or I hesitate to claim any real decolonization, because it's not. This is not a decolonized syllabus, but it's an effort to move in the direction of displacing white European patriarchy as the principal subject and object of the discourse, and so that plus and climate teaching, for me in particular, in the way that I've tried to teach this, as fundamental to this in all kinds of ways, and I'm sure everybody listening can think of other ways. So coal is very important. You can show coal in Newcastle on a slide and describe it, and then but connect that to Robert Owen and the attempt and the earlier use of water, and this is what Melm talks about, all the way up to oil.
Which is to very powerfully also connect concepts with real materials and their impacts upon us in terms of our production of them.
Sorry, yeah. No, I find, I am of the materialist persuasion, you can say, in a number of different ways. But I do find that students have a lot to say about material things, architecture students. And so we, but they saying not just empirically about, but theoretical observations and connections that they make quite quickly around, coal or oil. If you just, all you have to do is point out, this is how the steam engine works. Absolutely. They know, right?
I'm really fascinated by what you're drawing attention to here in terms of pedagogical infrastructures and rethinking how we do undertake this collaborative work of education. And you've paid a lot of attention to the importance of collaboration and acknowledging those students with whom you've been working. And it seems to me that there's something of a distinction between a vocational push on the one hand versus a more visionary approach to pedagogy. And I'm really feeling this in the Australian context at the moment, where there's a lot of emphasis on you study in order to get a job, but there's not much question about, well, in what milieu will I get that job? And how, in fact, do we kind of work in the other direction and recognize that our students are the ones who are going to go out there and shift the value systems that are in such desperate need of transformation?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, all of the above is extremely difficult under the best of circumstances. One of the things, though, that crises do, and it's not just this one, it's the other ones that I listed too, and this is why, in a sense, I'd say, persist with this, is that they loosen things, and they shake up assumptions and reframe questions, and that's what's happening as we speak, and we don't exactly know. Maybe some of the students who are listening in might have be able to report better on how the assumptions from their point of view are shifting, if indeed I'm correct about that. But as far as this kind of relationship between public pedagogy, doing work as we all do in different ways out in different public spheres, and then conceiving of the let's say the studio or the classroom itself as a public sphere in which one is addressing citizens, and not only of one's own country, obviously, but citizens and voters and critical members of society, as well as professionals. And that was my point about the lawyers running to the airport. They didn't get paid for that, right? That's our job. And a little bit back quickly to the question of theory and history is another way I think that we can think about this is I'm saying we, because we are the historians, are the custodians of the humanities in professional schools, in which the humanities sometimes are not given a whole lot of bandwidth and a whole lot of curricular time and space. One of the pedagogically roles that the humanities has played is, and this is nothing radical, this is very, very traditional, is the exercise of the imagination, the training of the imagination. And this is typical, like in the US undergraduate liberal arts colleges and so on. So when I teach history, I really do think about this as a little bit like an undergraduate college history class, in which, especially for people who have not encountered some of these histories before, and it is the first time there's not just the architectural history, the social history, the world history, the economic history. And so, to, in a sense, continue in the vocational setting or the professional setting, the work of liberal education. And then finally, to your point about let's say, the friction between these things, to do that with a radical realism. And the radical realism is to say, that's what the A&E is about. Is to first demystify the star system and say, this is hocus pocus. Basically, it's an embarrassment. And where the real world is, I don't mean like real world because they get paid more or something like that. It's where the power is. I will never forget seeing one of the most famous architects in the world just at the U.S. as the U.S. was preparing to invade Iraq. Being asked directly by a commentator on the news and U.S. television, would they oppose this invasion, and not being able to say anything. So, that problem, the role of intellectuals, the role of artists, and the role of citizens, all in one, is the problem of the classroom. And it's that work that in different ways, as I've explained, we've been trying to do.
I'm hearing you loud and clearly here, in fact, Reinhold, because recently our government is proposing to double the cost of undertaking a humanities degree, because when you study the humanities, well, presumably you're a less useful member of society and you're less able to get a job. And so we're really tackling with these questions of value here, and the crucial importance of the humanities, as you're drawing attention to, both in order to kind of recognize the political importance of our role as citizens and how we can participate in a democratic process, but also in situating, our various disciplines and what we do in terms of a history that now is so colored by climate crises. So these are powerful words that you're giving us here, and that relate very strongly to the kinds of issues we're tackling with. I also wonder whether it allows us to return to this key word that you've come back to as well, the role of the imagination, and a sort of challenge to reformat or re-engage the imagination, both for the students, but also in terms of a public imagination. I wonder whether you could speak a little bit more to this.
Yeah, well, I have to say that this is one of the ways in which it was actually gratifying. I'll use this as an opportunity because to show this one little piece of
Great.
The website. So this here is an event that's like, it's also out of nostalgia that we actually were able to gather in person on November 17th, 2019. It was not exactly the last public event that we coordinated at the Buell Center, and this wasn't at the Buell Center, but it was before this all happened. This was a collaboration with the Queen's Museum, so this is very important, and this is at the kind of other end of the public spectrum of publics, let's say, but it's another form of kind of self-pedagogy that that's what we're talking about. This is a public assembly that we co-organized with the Green New Deal, with the Queen's Museum, and with a couple of architect activists for San Francisco Casablanca and Gabriel Hernandez Solano, who have been involved in really basically street politics in New York in really interesting ways. Had worked with Ocasio-Cortez and so on and so forth. Gabriel works at Mass, and Casablanca works. He is a lighting designer in New York, and we work with them, the Architectural Lobby, AIA even, and the Queen's Museum to stage a public assembly. Basically, this is the democracy side. I mean, the basic idea of the Green New Deal is that decisions would be made democratically about the climate futures. And this is one of the critiques, as you know, of the New Deal, is that it was very technocratic, top-down, and this is an effort. This building in that ethos was an effort to displace that. the rule of experts kind of sort of model. And so we interpreted that and tried to put it into practice with these collaborators at the Queen's Museum. The Queen's Museum is at what we could call at the time ground zero of the Green New Deal. Sadly, this also became ground zero of the Corona crisis, which is Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's district that she represents. I don't know, for those who I guess people know this name, a very prominent progressive politician who represents a district, a congressional district in Queens and in the Bronx in New York City, and is the most outspoken figure in Congress around the Green New Deal. So basically this was like taking it back to where, in a sense, it originated as a House resolution, as a congressional proposal, and inviting the actual community. And the Queen's Museum has historically been really, has all these very ambitious and really great community outreach kinds of programs and work, and a kind of history of that. So they are trusted more than we would be, more than Columbia University would be trusted by people from frontline communities and activists also on the front lines, literally, of environmental justice and climate and so on in the New York area. And you know, this is immediately a kind of manifestation, if you understand the kind of geography of this, of the kinds of racial apartheids and eco-apartheids that I was describing before more generically. But these are situations in which these communities of color, they have been fighting like hell against developers and against various, you know, local industrial actors and so on. And so why would you trust, you know, some elite research center from Columbia University? So there was a lot of real work and trust building and so on that went into this. And again, I credit Jacob and Jordan very much for the day-to-day. I mean, really a lot of back and forth and phone calls and so on. But the net result was what you see. This is the morning. Hundreds of people came to the Queen's Museum, you know, in Queens. This is the old fairgrounds where the World's Fair was. And we set up themes, like different sub-themes and like discussion sections to discuss. There's videos here of people discussing these matters related to the Green New Deal. And then there were public talks. There were a number of local politicians. AOC was busy with impeachment, so she sent a video. This is her, one of the people who actually wrote the Green New Deal, her policy director on this, who was there and spoke, and a number of the panels. And we have colleagues here. This is my colleague from urban planning, Leah Meisterlin, and a number of activists and specialists. There are engineers here. There are lawyers, all kinds of folks. And so that, you know, we tried to at least think about that and model that. It's like, this is what you could do. If you're going to do this, this is one way that we could do this in an inclusive and democratic way. And you get a lot of disagreement. There is almost no shared assumption, to be honest. I mean, you know, even though it's obviously a self-selecting group, but there's quite a lot of disagreement. Think about what the discussion around nuclear would be, for example. That was one of the themes on these panels. But you know, you actually, you know, through, this was just for one day, but by the end of the day, there's something like a public is formed. And that is also what architecture and urbanism and infrastructure can do. They can call, by proposing things, you know, representing, offering matters to be debated, like, you know, decommission the Indian Point nuclear power plant. Okay, what are you going to do with it? You know, how are you going to provide the energy at half of New York City, and so on and so forth? You know, they spend a whole day talking about that, and then, you know, it's not like anything actually gets worked out. That's not the point, to solve the problem. The point is to repose the question in a public fashion, and you know, with the input of people who are either directly affected or involved directly with these matters, much more than any of us are, to be frank. I mean, in a day-to-day sense.
No, but
So,
then the lesson still for our discipline concerns the kinds of questions we can ask through our disciplinary lens, and how we can perhaps rethink the sorts of skill sets we have to direct them toward these other political ends, that, you know, rethinking of the public and so forth. And I wonder too, in the midst of all of this, if we can circle back round to this, the important role of care here, the kind of crises of care, which reminds me also of a Nancy Fraser paper where she draws attention to the relationship between care and infrastructure too.
and it would be honest, for sure.
Yeah. And I wonder whether you could speak more to the importance of care here, which also has, of course, it's in an ethics of care, it's sort of feminist philosophical genealogy as well.
Right, no, absolutely. And all of the above, again, is, and I'm glad that you can hear that, because it's intended. All that is intended. And of course, you know, within those discussions, and then once it as it were, is these matters are sort of concretized in like, you know, whether it's a curriculum or a project or a text, what might sound, you know, not too controversial can become controversial. So for example, who pays for the care is controversial. Whether or not profit is to be made from that care is controversial. And of course, who performs that work? This has been, like, feminized care work is, you know, very much in the public consciousness right now, mostly through the amazing work that nurses and teachers and others have done to get us through this as best we can. But, you know, it's not like their salaries have gone up. And so this can easily, there are billboards all around New York City that thanking the nurses, thanking, you know, but there's not one of them mentions, you know, increasing their wages. In fact, it's the CEOs who commission, you know, it's the healthcare, you know, big hospital corporations and whatever, and pharma, that they're the first ones with the billboards. They will probably acknowledge, in a sense, the feminization of care work. But the question is, where are the fault lines? Where's the limit to this? And the limit in this case, I think, is it's a sort of socioeconomic one that cuts across. So you can follow this from education to other areas. I should tell you that I think these are online. Naomi Klein was doing some really excellent panels at Rutgers. She was a guest professor, Gloria Steinem, guest professor of women's studies, something like that, at Rutgers this past year. And in fact, we had begun the discussion of collaborating, doing joint panels or whatever, but then this whole thing happened. But she did these great panels at Rutgers on care work as climate work. And that's, I think there's a video of hers that I think is on our links, in which she talks about that. So that's a concept that she has really advanced. And I think it does come, you know, out of the Nancy Fraser tradition, basically, or discourse, roughly. So yeah, I mean, and then, but you know, then if you kind of hold those thoughts, that constellation of thoughts, and then I had this other seemingly more banal, mundane, very classical way of describing these things as like building types, like a school, a hospital, and you know, and a what did I say? And a housing project. It was either going to be a house or a housing project.
Yeah.
But they then, you know, how to connect. The built reality, as sometimes we will say in architecture, of those things, or even the way of thinking, like typology, you know, and the critique of the political economy of care, or the gender and racial politics of care work, the climate politics of care, and so on. I mean, by the way, for anybody who's curious and wondering why one is able to put these, care work is generally considered low carbon because it's human work. It's work done by people with other people. It doesn't involve a lot of machines. It doesn't involve a lot of oil. or other energy. You do have to commute probably to work, and of course the work environment has to be sustained. But this is one of the reasons that this kind of work is considered, low carbon, and therefore worthy of public investment, even from a relatively generic point of view, of thinking about reinvesting in green jobs and things like that. So to cut to the chase, basically what I think that thinking in this very concrete typological sense can do is to say that you just learn to look at those buildings. You see all of that is happening inside. All of that. From the political economy to the gender politics to race to really the way the society itself is imagined. And the simple act, which is difficult, it's basically a speech act because it has to be performed over and over again hopefully with more authority. In other words, that it would be authorized by the society to put the word public in front of those types without apology.
Absolutely.
Affirmatively, which is to say, in terms of the budget, and in terms of the client, and in terms of the user, and all these kind of boring things that architects think they do when they're not designing. That's where the work of the imagination is. And so, rule of thumb would be the work of the imagination, the way that we're talking about it, is actually happening in the professional practice class. As much as or more than it's happening in the design studio. Those decisions are already made by the time you get to the design studio. There can be a feedback loop set up between the two, but then the design teaching has to exercise a kind of critical imagination that in my experience at least, is not so typical in a review, or you get into very interesting philosophical discussions. But how to change professional practice, like change the contract, or whether you would not take the job because it's a police station, which I hope every architect in this country is thinking about right now, is tougher, because there's a lot of contradictions in there. You got to keep the people employed who are in your office. You have to pay the rent. So it's not an easy set of questions.
No, and also to understand that the visionary isn't just about what a project looks like or the most fabulous render, but also concerns all of that paperwork and the policies and the specifications and all of this other labor that's so crucial to architecture too, that should be recognized as such.
Yeah.
I'm certainly getting a lot out of this discussion, and I think I have many more questions I might like to ask too. It also strikes me, I've certainly noticed in writings and discussions around this broad theme of infrastructure that very often the question of failure is the one that's articulated to talk of infrastructure, and you've made note of this too, so that we don't even recognize that infrastructure is part of an environment that facilitates our lives. We don't recognize this until that moment of failure at which we suddenly realize how much we've come to depend upon it. And well, I have to confess too that I've been running a design studio formerly with colleagues in Sweden with the theme of infrastructural love, and we've been very interested in bringing in a care thematic. It's been fun, and we've recognised together that in fact when an infrastructure fails, it's less the kind of technical failure than the failure of a state, so to speak. It's a failed state that allows its infrastructures to fall apart, which places all so much more at stake. And I think this is what we're hearing clearly too with the urgency around the Green New Deal and its infrastructural effects.
Yeah, and sometimes I think you can even go so far as to say that failure is planned. It may not be directly planned in the sense that somebody actually said this is going to fail. But it's anticipated, it's expected, and it's normally in the form of some sort of risk-benefit calculation, cost-benefit calculation, and sadly, I think that this is basic. This is how I would characterize what happened in Flint, Michigan, with the poisoning of again a majority Black community by basically through completely unconscionable, cost-cutting, managerial decision-making. And with this, and of course there are legal cases and so on still unfolding about who ultimately and how responsibility is to be distributed. But we know, it's it's not too many steps usually from the failure to some sense of awareness. And climate change is the sort of classical one, because infrastructure has this sense of being kind of running automatically in the background, like there are no human beings involved. Engineers might have set it up and they push the button and it runs, and you call them in when it breaks down. But in fact, the infrastructure is very interesting and complicated, I think, in this way that the way I have come to define infrastructure is that infrastructure is what repeats. And so that's why we can think of classes, like teaching a class as infrastructure in an infrastructural sense. It repeats. It's just every week you show up at a certain time and you do something. And those repetitions are very often automated in particular ways. Our repetitions in showing up for the art, in some sense, automated. If we don't show up, the whole thing, goes haywire. So but the act of showing up, in a sense, the act of repeating, is an act that for which there are agents, there is responsibility, there is accountability, and certainly all of those just think of any electric meter. These are calculated, and profit is made over the repetition from the repetition of infrastructure. And so again, cost benefit calculations are made. This grid might go out. This is what we're going to do. If the grid goes out, we can tolerate this much outage, and so on and so forth. That's all part of the engineering. But so a pedagogy of infrastructure, kind of a way of thinking, as it sounds like you're doing as well, I suppose would try to tune in a little more closely to those repetitions, and to their rhythms, their patterns. And as you say, there are interruptions, and to take responsibility, to hold accountable, and to make critical, informed value judgments about how things do and do not repeat.
Thank you so very much. I think we've basically run out of time now, but I just want to thank you for spending this time with us, and I've really enjoyed the discussion, and it was great to get a tour through the Power website.
I hope it was informative, and like I said, anybody come and click through and read and watch videos and so on, and use it in your teaching, anything you want to do. It's all there.
Yeah, and there's a generosity in that too, in sort of rendering that available, all of that pedagogical material, which is great. We could run a class straight off the website, I reckon.
Yeah, I know. Maybe one day. Thought about that.
Okay, well, thanks for your time, and I look forward to speaking to you again.
Okay, thank you, everybody. Okay,
right.
take care.
Thanks. Bye-bye. And now, before everyone leaves, I'm going to share my screen, because tonight at 6 p.m. we have Philip Block, Jane Burry and Roland Snooks who will be speaking to us within MSD at Home. Not only that, but you'll find that you can also tune in for the second offering of From Here for Now. Hard choices to be made. You can probably kind of have both open simultaneously and be in two places at once. If you're not keen on that, then I'll also draw your attention to the final slide here, which shows you how you can look at any of these previous events online. So just follow this link through to the YouTube account, and you'll be able to listen in on the lectures and events all over again. We hope you've enjoyed the session today. Thank you very much for joining us.